Hi, I'm Susan Mary Grant. I'm Professor of American History at Newcastle University, and the title of this podcast is How Did Events from 1820 Lead to Increasing Sectional Tension Between North and South? Okay, this podcast addresses the question of how events from 1820 led to increasing sectional tension between North and South in the United States. Now, this is a huge period in America's history, and I think if you're addressing it, it's quite useful to divide it into three separate sections and look at first politics, then people, and finally perspectives. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. So starting with politics, I suppose the question that would be most useful for you to ask would be, what political changes did America undergo after 1820? But before you can really address that, you have to look at the background. 1820 as a year has been chosen because it was a year of what was known as the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise was essentially about maintaining a balance between the slave and free states within the United States Congress. But to understand why this was important, you really have to go back to the origins of America as a nation. America emerges as a separate nation. It defeats the British and becomes a separate country in the 18th century at a time when slavery is gradually coming under attack. The slave trade is hugely powerful, but slavery, morally and in religious terms, is starting to be questioned. When America establishes itself as a nation and establishes its constitution, essentially, it fudges the issue. It compromises on this very crucial point of slavery. And what they come up with in Philadelphia, when they're discussing the Constitution, is what's known as the 3/5 clause. So a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. And what this really meant was that the slaveholding parts of America, now at this point that's the whole of America, but increasingly it becomes just the South. But the slaveholding parts of America have greater representation in Congress, and that is the issue. So every slave they have counts for 3/5 of a person. So as America grows as a nation, and this is the other point that you have to bear in mind, is that the extremely quick growth of the United States, geographically and demographically in this period, means that inevitably there's going to be a clash between the slave and the free states within Congress. So before 1820, for example, you have three states that join the Union that are free states because they're covered by what was known as the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery from some of these territories. And these states were Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So these three states came in and slavery was not allowed in them. But three states also came into what was known as the South: Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Alabama came in as a state in 1819. And this was fine because it was three states free, three states slave. But then what happened was that Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, wanted to become a separate state. But if that had happened, it would have thrown the balance off. And so this is what the Missouri Compromise was all about in 1820. This idea that for a state to join the Union, you had to have one slave and one free state coming in simultaneously to try and maintain that balance, and it was really problematic. Thomas Jefferson, perhaps the most famous founding father of America, author of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, he described the Missouri Compromise as a fire bell in the night. He wrote to a friend that it was something that awakened him and filled him with terror because he felt the Union would not endure. It would come apart over the slavery issue. So when you're looking at the period after 1820, that's the background. You've already got problems predicated on slavery within the United States. After 1820, gradually what you find is a removal of slavery from the political arena. And this isn't always obvious from the textbooks you'll be reading, because you get the sense that the whole issue is gradually, it's incremental. It's becoming increasingly problematic. It's getting worse and worse. It's all anybody's ever talking about. But actually, in real terms, slavery is removed from the political arena and it becomes something much more discussed at the edges of politics. So I mean, that's the first thing you've got to think about, but then politics itself changes after 1820. And so what you're really looking for is the rise of what's known as free soil. Now, free soil is both a concept and it becomes, in 1848, a political party. The nation after 1820 is expanding. It's expanding westwards. And as I've said, this is a battleground. It becomes a battleground over whether states are going to be slave or free when they come into the Union. And sometimes it's also a battleground over the respective roles of the states and the federal government. Who controls these areas? You know, who decides on things like taxation, which sounds really very dull, but it's very important for a new nation. And basically what's roughly happening is the North are very keen on taxation because they want to protect their tariffs, they want to protect the nation, they see it as a way of bringing in revenue and growing the nation. The South are not so keen on tariffs because they want to trade with Europe, they want to trade cotton. And you have various flashpoints that are problematic. The first of these is in 1831 with what's known as the nullification crisis, where a southern state, South Carolina, basically says it's not going to pay the taxes imposed by the federal government. So there's these two things that are running in parallel, the issue of slavery and the issue of states' rights, as it's known. And they kind of reinforce each other in this period after 1820. And so gradually free soil, this idea of free soil, especially in the states of the West, it develops into an actual active political party. And the important thing you've got to bear in mind, I suppose, is that it's not about eradicating slavery, it's about keeping the West white. Many free soilers are deeply racist and they simply do not want African Americans in the West. So it's not that they're taking a moral angle, they're taking a very practical economic one. And then other flashpoints after nullification, you have the Mexican War between 1846 and 1848. America gets more territory, but it's also a very unpopular war. It's seen as a pro-slavery war. It was called Mr. Polk's War after the president at the time. And what this amounts to is a gradual erosion of the American political system as it exists in the 19th century. It was known as the two-party system, or the second-party system sometimes, and it comprised two parties, Whigs and Democrats. But gradually the Whigs start to disintegrate in the period after 1820. And you get what now we would call the rise of third-party politics. And they take many forms. You have the Know Nothing Party, which are a very racist party. They're a nationalist party. They're very anti-Catholic. And you have the free soil people as well. Things really come to a head, however, unsurprisingly, when gold is discovered in California. The process of becoming a state, an area would be a territory, and then when its population reached a certain number, it could apply for statehood. But as soon as gold is discovered in California, of course, the federal government think, well, we want that into the union as quickly as we possibly can. So they fast track it. But the question is it going to be slave or free? There is no other balancing state to bring into the union along with California. So what happens is you have another compromise, not the Missouri Compromise this time, but the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850, it secures the balance, I suppose, in the Union, but it has several problematic elements to it. And one of these is a revised fugitive slave law. Now, there had been a fugitive slave law, but in 1850 this is tightened up. And what it translates into is the ability for Southerners, Southern slaveholders, to come north and retrieve runaway slaves. And this causes many more problems than you might think a piece of paper would cause. A few years after that, the political situation is worsening. The whole issue of slavery in the territories is not being resolved. And particularly when it comes to two very large territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Now, these had been purchased by Jefferson in 1803 under the Louisiana Purchase. And the whole idea was, under the Compromise of 1850, that popular sovereignty, as it was known, would decide whether these territories would be slave or free. So in other words, the population could decide. But all this meant was that the population simply rowed with each other. And so if there was ever an election, people would bring in supporters from across state lines or across territory lines. And it was a very violent situation on the borders of Kansas and Nebraska. And so gradually political groups start to coalesce around this whole idea of opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Whig Party is no longer a viable political force in Congress. You have increasing violence in Kansas. A man called John Brown, who will later become famous in 1859, he leads a massacre at a place called Potawatomi Creek because he's very opposed to slavery. In Congress itself, in Washington, you also have violence. A very famous Northern senator called Charles Sumner is beaten half to death by a Southern congressman called Preston Brooks because Sumner had insulted one of Brooks's relatives. But Sumner was very radically anti-slavery, and Brooks, of course, was a slaveholder. So it's against this backdrop that you find the political realignment that is so crucial to what happens after 1820. It's against this backdrop that you have the emergence of a new political party, the Republicans, who comprise a very broad church of disaffected Democrats who were opposed to slavery, know-nothings who were opposed to Catholics, people who had a moral angle on slavery, people who had an economic angle on slavery. The Republicans first stand for election in 1856, but they don't actually win then. But their slogan is free soil, free labour, free men. And in 1856, and Fremont, because John C. Fremont was their candidate. As I say, they don't win in 1856, they do win in 1860, and this is really the crucial point for sectionalism in America, because the Republicans are truly a sectional party. They don't have any appeal in the South because they are totally opposed to the expansion of slavery, and it's against this background that the Union comes apart because Southerners are so opposed to the Republicans and so worried by the implications of their election.